This evening, our guest is Diane Rappaport, and I just met her moments ago, and learned that she is not only a former trial lawyer, but is also an historian and a genealogist. And she's taken a great deal of interest in the early legal structures of the court system here in Massachusetts and early New England. And she has some books that she's written, and you see them over there on the table, and one of which, of course, is the of tonight's presentation, The Naked Quaker, True Crimes and Controversies from the Courts of Colonial New England. Now, I think she's going to tell us about some stories, some shocking and revealing episodes that took place in those early days. And I'm certainly looking forward to listening to this, and hope you all will too. And so now I present Diane Rappaport, who's done quite a bit of presentations, by the way, of this type of topic. Here's Diane.
Well, thank you. First, can everyone, oh, no, you probably can't hear me because I didn't turn the mic on. Now can you hear me better? Okay. All right. Well, Quaker women were taking their clothes off in public to protest the Puritans, right here in Massachusetts in the 1600s. Hardly anybody knows this quirky fact about our colonial heritage. I was surprised, too, when I first started digging into old court records and found out about this. And in fact, I learned so many things that surprised me about what our colonial forebears were up to. Now, I think for most of us, if we think about the 17th century at all, we picture kind of bleak images. We think of people sitting in the stocks for punishment, perhaps, reading the Bible by candlelight, wearing those really dull, ugly sort of clothes, we assume, with black, broad-brimmed hats, buckles, we think they had on everything. But actually, those are sort of stereotypes. And people in the 17th century were fairly fashion conscious, wore bright colors often. And we rarely think of our earliest ancestors here in New England as being the sort of people who had fun, much less sex, except perhaps for the unfortunate Hester Prynne in Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic Scarlet Letter. But human nature hasn't changed that much in 350 years, and the court records pretty clearly demonstrate that. They reveal a Puritan and colonial society that was far more unruly and irreverent than we're accustomed to reading about in history books. Now, not everyone got in trouble, of course, but there was so much against the law back then, not only the laws that the legislatures passed and the town meetings passed, but also all those moral and church rules, because there wasn't very much separation of church and state in those days. And ordinary people were quick to sue each other, too, for all kinds of things that seem surprising and outlandish today. An argument between neighbors, nasty words spoken, could resolve in a slander suit very often. Wandering livestock could bring people into court, all kinds of things, and I'll tell you more this evening. But if you think that this litigation explosion that you're always hearing so much about, if you think that that is strictly a modern phenomenon, then you haven't read enough 17th century court records. Now, people always, I should mention before I get into this much, people always ask how I got started reading old court records, writing a book called The Naked Quaker, of all things, which I never imagined I'd be doing. And as you heard, I started my career as a trial lawyer, first in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and then about 25 years ago, I moved to the Boston area. But colonial American history was my first love. I got my undergraduate degree in colonial and, American history. And so every place I've lived, I've wanted to know more about the local history. history, and particularly when I moved to Massachusetts, where so much of that history I've studied happened. And I live in Lexington now, and about, a dozen years ago or so, I was looking in a town history book and ran across a blurb about one of the earliest settlers of my town, a man named William Monroe, who actually came here against his will as a Scottish slave. Hardly anyone knows that there were Scots sold here to the English colonists in the early days. They had been brought over here as war prisoners. And anyway, I wanted to find out more about him and some of his fellow Scots, so I decided, just for the fun of it, to go to the Massachusetts Archives. It's a wonderful repository of old records of all sorts. And to my delight, I ran across a stash of forgotten court records about William Monroe and about so many other people that, ordinary people, not only the English colonists, but Native Americans, Africans, all kinds of forgotten people, and wonderful human interest stories that I couldn't bear to keep hidden away in the archives with nobody knowing about them. So before long, I started writing a column for New England Ancestors magazine. Some of you may have seen it. And this is the cover of the first column I wrote. I call it Tales from the Courthouse. And it was my story, The Case of the Purloined Pigs, which I'll tell you about tonight, about that man who lived not too far from my own home in Lexington. And I still write for them. But before long, after my column started, readers started asking me how they could find stories like this about their own ancestors. So I wrote my first book, New England Court Records, a research guide for genealogists and historians that tells how to find and use court records from the 17th to the 21st centuries. And I'm pleased that it did win several national awards and regional as well. But what I love doing the most is telling these stories from the old court records. And readers encouraged me to put together a book of my favorites. It was hard to choose favorites, really. I could have come up with a 1,000-page book. There's so many stories. But my publisher wanted a slim little volume. So I settled for 25 true stories in my latest book, The Naked Quaker. And they're gathered in columns like chapters like Witches and Wild Women, Frontier Justice, Tavern Tales, and such. And I think they're a surprising and sometimes shocking look at what our early New England ancestors were up to. And I'll tell you a few of those stories this evening, and some not in the book, some Topsfield related stories that are not in the book as well. And before I begin, I just always like to mention I give a lot of talks around New England, and almost every time someone comes up afterwards and says, "That was my ancestor you told us about." So please, if I tell about your ancestor this evening, do introduce yourself. Introduce yourself anyway, but I always enjoy meeting the descendants of these people who feel like friends to me after I've spent so much time studying and writing about them. So let me give you a quick preview of what I thought I would cover. Everyone wants to know about The Naked Quaker, my title story, and there was more than one, but I'll tell you a bit about that. And some Topsfield protesters, not naked ones, but other Sunday protests that you may or may not be aware of. And there were a lot of witchcraft cases, way before those famous Salem ones of 1692. And I'll tell a bit about some suspected witches. Also, it was against the law in 17th century Massachusetts to disobey your parents. And there was a particularly notorious rebellious son that I will tell you about, who lived not too far from here. And you may or may not be surprised to know that even in Puritan days, many cases of troublemaking and crime and so forth involved alcohol, and people like to go to parties even then, back in those days. And I'll tell about a college party that doesn't different from modern days. And back then too, it wasn't such a prudish time. People, men and women, often had trouble keeping their hands off each other in ways that were the authorities considered to be unsuitable, and so they sometimes had to appear in court to explain themselves. And I'll tell about a couple of couples, including the family of Daniel and Faith Black from old Topsfield, who spent some time in court, and another story that has some surprising modern day relevance. And then well, you remember probably an old saying, good fences make good neighbors. Well, when fences weren't good, and that often happened in colonial New England, there could be problems. And the purloined pigs case that as I like to call it, is a very good example of that, and I'll close with that story. So, first, the naked Quaker. Now, as you may or may not be aware, back in the early Puritan days, Puritans were all, that was the only game in town really here. The Puritans did not want other religions practicing among them, and Quakers were not permitted to, it was against the law to be a Quaker and to live in Massachusetts in the 1650s. Quakers were not permitted to meet together in groups. They were not allowed to teach other people about their beliefs. And they, like everyone in the Puritan colonies, they were expected to attend the Sunday Puritan church services, regardless of how they felt about it. And if they didn't, the consequences could be serious. Anything from fines to whippings to banishment from the colony for people who wouldn't stay quiet. And I forgot to move along here. I wanted to show you, among the authorities who persecuted the Quakers were people like Governor Endicott, he was this friendly-looking gentleman, I think, and other authorities. But anyway, Quakers who wouldn't stay banished from the colony, like Mary Dyer, shown here in this drawing, walking to the gallows, some of those Quakers were executed, hanged. But by the early 1660s, the King of England put a stop to the executions. I don't think he liked Quakers particularly, but he apparently felt it wasn't very good PR for the crown to be hanging people over their religious beliefs. So he told the Massachusetts authorities to stop that. So no more hangings, but Quakers still were expected to come to the Puritan services Sunday mornings and still would be punished. They knew they wouldn't be killed if they didn't, but they faced punishment in any case. And so I tell what happened one particular Sunday morning, April 1663, in the town of Newbury, Massachusetts, the part that's today Newburyport. And on that Sunday morning, all the local people trekked to the Newbury meeting house. Some of them had to walk miles to get to church on time. And contemporary records say that it was an unusually cold spring that year. So New England, there may well have been snow on the ground that April. So people would have filed into the meeting house, a very simple, plain building, taken their assigned seats, because everyone was assigned a seat based on their social status or their age. Probably was just a backless bench, very simple. And they would have kept their heavy wraps on as they sat there waiting, because I was surprised about this when I first learned it, but in those days, the meeting houses rarely were heated, even in the depths of winter. And part of the reason for that was it was a multi-purpose building, and one of the purposes usually was to store the local gunpowder. So as you can imagine, it wasn't safe to light fires. So picture, if you will, all those people sitting there waiting for the minister to start his sermon. They were shivering, most likely. And suddenly a woman walked in the doorway and dropped her dress, took off her clothes. And I'll switch to a blank screen, so you can use your own imagination. Though I think the designer of my book, the cover designer, came up with a cute, not too R-rated image of what he thought the scene might have appeared to look like to the people sitting there. Well, the naked woman was a Quaker, and her name was Lydia Wardell. She was actually from New Hampshire, but it was governed by Massachusetts in those days. And she and her Quaker husband had been punished over and over and over and over again for refusing to attend the Sunday services at the Puritan meeting houses. So apparently, and she didn't leave us a written record of her motivations, but apparently she finally decided that if she was going to have to attend these services that she didn't approve of, she was going to do something dramatic to express her contempt for the authorities. And, something that a woman could do. And as you can imagine, her Lady Godiva stunt got a lot of attention. She was arrested and so forth. But what surprised me when I started digging into this more was that she was not the first in the 17th century to use public nudity as a protest tactic. Actually, about a decade earlier in London, Quaker men were taking their clothes off in public to protest what they called the spiritual nakedness of their persecutors. But here in the colonies, it was the women who were the feistiest of the Quakers. I haven't found any cases of men in public nudity. If you know some, I haven't scoured every case out there, so I'll be interested. But there were several Quaker women who resorted to nudity. And in fact, a few weeks before Lydia's naked protest, another Quaker woman, appropriately named, I think, her middle name anyway, Deborah Buffum Wilson, strolled through the streets of Salem, no clothes on. Her mother and sister walked at her side to give her support. They kept their clothes on, though. But Deborah and her mother and sister and Lydia, of course, a few weeks later, they were all arrested by the authorities. They were brought to trial. They were punished. And according to the court records, they were severely whipped. And what I found ironic was that even though their public nudity offended the authorities, they were stripped to the waist in the public square for their whippings. However, that was pretty much the standard procedure for whipping in those days. So I don't think they necessarily got special punishment. Now, in those days, feisty women and sometimes men got into even more trouble, being accused of witchcraft. Oh, wait, I forgot. But before I move on to that, I wanted to tell you a bit about some other protests, because we had some going on here in Topsfield. And I should mention that the ministers in those days, even though this is a painting, just to give you an example of what they looked like. This is Richard Mather from Dorchester. They were never women, men of very high social rank. They knew Latin and Greek and so forth, but they were not always popular with their congregations. And people sometimes, I was surprised to find how people openly criticized their ministers, sometimes yelling out insults in church, or certainly being very open in the local tavern, telling what they thought. One woman in Gloucester called her minister a bloodthirsty man, and another one said that her minister was fitter to be a lady's chambermaid than a preacher. I liked the one of a woman, I think she was in Charlestown, who said that she would rather hear a cat meow than listen to her minister preach. And people like that, usually, they were punished. They couldn't just say that and not get punished. They were usually forced to make some kind of public penance. The churches were not that fancy. That's somebody's drawing of how they imagined it. But they would have to sit there, and in addition to being usually fined, sometimes whipped. Now, here in Topsfield, there were exact one of your early settlers. Actually, he got in trouble a number of times. I have seen that he apparently had some Quaker sympathies and perhaps entertained Quakers in his home at some point, but I didn't manage to track down that particular court citation. But I did find in 1656 he was refusing to attend services, and he was punished for that. And in 1659, he was admonished for what they called abusive carriages at the meeting house. And I didn't look in all of the back records of this, I just saw the summary of it. But apparently he talked out loud when the minister was trying to speak, tried to disrupt his sermon, kept his hat on and turned his back on some of the proceedings. But that was kind of a code thing to do in those days if you had Baptist sympathies. Often people would turn their backs on baptisms. Baptists at that time were illegal too. But they believed that only adults should be baptized, and, not infants who had no choice in the matter. So it's very, very likely that was what was going on with that action. And he called the minister Perkins a hireling, which was apparently a nasty insult. And a few years later, I believe John was Zacchaeus' son. You people probably know more about this. At least he was a Gould who lived here in Topsfield. I know about that, and his wife Sarah. There was quite a brouhaha. They accused the minister Thomas Gilbert of being drunk very often in church, and they saw him, really guzzling the communion wine, and being worse the wear for it after that. And Gilbert, he tried to retaliate. He did sue Sarah, called her for lying, slandering, and rash swearing. And so there was a bunch in the court records. John Gould finally filed a petition saying that they really didn't want to have this man as their minister anymore unless he could behave himself. And he also countersued for the slanderous things that he said Gilbert was saying about his wife, and he did win. And Gilbert apparently finally left, and that may have been part of the reason Topsfield ended up with Parson Capon. So anyway, I thought you might be interested to know how some of that may have come about. Now, as I did start to say, witchcraft was another really hot issue back in those days, and a lot of suspected witches way before the ones in Salem, and everybody believed in witchcraft basically in those days, no matter how well educated people were. They assumed that there was a devil who got ordinary people to sign his book and agree to do, nasty things. And so when bad things happened in a community, people were very quick to assume that witchcraft might be the cause. And neighbors, friends, family members could end up in court on trial for their lives because it was a capital crime. And there were witchcraft cases all over New England, and various communities tried different methods of figuring out who among them might be witches. A couple of cases in Connecticut, the communities used the time-honored method, probably brought over from Old England or Europe, where they suspected a couple, the Ayers family, and they bound these suspected witches hand and foot, threw them in the local pond. And the way the water test went, if the witches sank, if the suspect sank, they were let's see, do I have it right? If they floated, they were witches. If they sank, they were innocent. But there was not much of a win-win situation here that could come about.